The Simpsons.
Hello, and welcome to the Simpsons Countdown, the podcast where we go back to the beginning and watch all of The Simpsons to trace its creative evolution and count down, finding the exact moment in which the show began to suck. I'm your host, Erix Antoine, and this week I'm once again joined by Jason Pollock. We are discussing the episode The Telltale Head, which originally aired on February 25th, 1990. I love discussing things with Pollock because he is a very quick-witted person with strong opinions on just about everything. And so this classic episode in which Bart beheads the statue of the town hero gives us quite a lot to discuss. And we do. We talk about the episode's themes and whether or not it explores those themes to their full potential. Since this episode also introduces the character of Apu, you can imagine we have a couple of things to say about that as well. We talk about a lot of stuff in the 45 minutes that follow. Everything from Apu to a religious upbringing in the Midwest to sexy Latin American variety shows aimed at children. It's jam-packed and fast-paced. So please do get comfortable. Whether you're lying in bed or sitting on your couch, jogging on the treadmill or sitting on the toilet, I hope you enjoy the discussion that follows. Here we go. So, how are we doing, Jason? Welcome back. Welcome back to the podcast. It's been a pretty hectic time as of this recording around, the socio-political, geopolitical environment of March has been pretty hectic for everyone involved, I think. So let's distract ourselves by talking about
I can think of no better way to distract ourselves than talking about the socio-political ramifications of the first appearance of Apu. I think this is the first time you actually see him, and he's a weird. He's not even like a weird punchline. He's just like the accent is the punchline, which I think was a big thing in the 80s and 90s, like that. Like every hacky stand-up had his bit about how sucky New Jersey was, and they had there was always like a Hindustani, Pakistani convenience store owner or operator. It's weird. I think of like Darkman has a bit where the villain walks into a convenience store and the guy behind the counter has a turban on and asks him if he would like a bag for this, please, buddy. And Loaded Weapon 1 does a Pakistani convenience store owner. Like, it was like bad shtick. And it's weird that the Simpsons, being a group of such talented writers and talented performers, went, you know what? Let's go lowest common denominator here for a second. Pakistani guy behind the counter.
There is one notable and I think crucial 90s picture that avoids this. In the classic Michael Douglas vehicle Falling Down, in that one, Mr. Lee is Korean.
They took a page from the urban films of the time.
Yes, very much so. Now, another film from the period, the gang war film Strapped, directed by Forrest Whitaker, I believe. It was an HBO film, and I believe the convenience store clerk in that one is also, well, I don't know if he's Korean. They don't really. He's Asian. He's either Korean or Chinese. It's not specified.
You go now. No trouble. I stay. What do you think of that? God, where you go? What do you do?
Now, going back to The Simpsons, to be fair, I do believe that in the original script, the character is just described as convenience store clerk. There's no mention made of any nationality or ethnicity or anything of that nature. And then when recording the script, when doing the recording, they had Hank Azaria try out different things. And ultimately the one that they stuck with was the Hindu one. It's something that I'm going to want to talk about eventually on this podcast because it's definitely an issue and there's definitely something. But I think that when the time comes, I would love for it to be an episode that's more about Apu. I mean, here he really is just a throwaway gag. It's right. Just sort of like the kids go into the convenience store, they shoplift, and he's just there to do a funny voice, and he's a very irrelevant character in the episode. He has nothing to do with it. So, and it's almost like, you can tell, I mean, you can't tell, but I would imagine that when they did that, they didn't know for sure that that character would be coming back. I mean, what do you think? Do you think they were like, oh, cool, and now that, we've made this Indian, if we, we've made this character, let's bring him back. I don't know if at that moment, because again, in the script, it was just convenience store clerk or Quickie Mart clerk or whatever. So
along the way, you try to actually flesh out all of these characters, because when you've been on the air for, 74 years, what can you do but give every single action figure a backstory and give every single Simpsons character an action figure? So, I don't know. It's one of those things where I feel like maybe even before the recent controversy, there was the realization in some quarters, especially as the show begins to kind of hit its, I mean, obviously we're nowhere near this now, but as it hits its sort of sociopolitical awareness, a sense of itself in terms of what it's doing and what it's saying about the culture, they decide, hey, some of these stereotypes, we should actually try to develop them as characters and actually make them, some semblance of fully rounded person, which is why I think the recent flap with the documentary and everything was more about Hank Azaria playing a character who he's obviously not of any Middle Eastern or Hindustani or Pakistani descent. So it's almost robbing a performer of something they could do in a less stereotypical way and in a more honest way. It's less about the character and more about you basically hired a white guy to play a not a white guy. Like, come on, that's weird. Because everybody does, with as long as The Simpsons has been on, everybody does become this weirdly fully rounded character. We're just not there yet. And so this episode overall, it feels super tiny.
Oh, in comparison with the grander scheme of things, absolutely. Although there are quite a bit of things here. I guess going back to that and kind of to maybe wrap this segment for the moment. I don't know that it was intentional. I think it kind of worked out that way. And then, of course, they ran with it. I mean, Azaria had already done the voice the first time. They just figured, well, whatever. They just didn't think about it. And then, of course, when it was pointed out to them, they found different ways of either sweeping it under the rug or whatever. We could say that the powers that be handled it rather oddly, in some cases questionably.
Something that started decades ago and was applauded and inoffensive is now politically incorrect. What can you do?
Some things will be dealt with at a later date.
If at all.
But to Azaria's credit, and one may feel differently about this depending on their sensibilities, but to Azaria's credit, he has stated in recent interviews that he will no longer be voicing the character of Apu.
Yeah.
He has said that whether they want to continue with the character or not, that's up to them, but he will not provide the voice for the character anymore. So that, I guess that at the very least is something. But I don't know that it's what... I mean, the right thing then would be to recast, but maybe they'll just say, you know what, let's just phase this character out and just be done with it. And that would be a shame if they do that, because for better or worse, as you said, they eventually did flesh him out, and he's more than just a stereotype. Like, he's actually a character that has some value. They don't entirely make him a caricature. They do use him to sort of tell some stories that explore aspects maybe of that culture that could be interesting. So it would be a shame if they decide to just drop him altogether, rather than bring in an actor of that ethnicity who could explore it even further and maybe bring more issue. Although by this point, it doesn't even matter. I mean, we're talking 30 years later. Should The Simpsons even still be on?
I can't believe in some ways that it's still on just because of the expense of the cast at this point.
I mean, they keep these people on contract. Obviously, God knows how much money they're spending on them. They've never recast. And the show is still on. And you wonder, it's not like they couldn't have recast and gotten impersonators to do those voices by now. I mean, these are such indelible things. But who knows, in the end, how these things work.
All right, that'll be $2.65. Ain't the same sandwich. His was bigger. The same fucking sandwich.
Yes, this shit was bigger.
The same goddamn sandwich, all right?
You make my sandwich bigger too, all right?
Get the fuck out of the store!
The Telltale Head. That is the episode we are talking about today. Which is not necessarily. It's the episode itself. Although it is notable for being the introduction of Apu, it's not really about that, as we were saying. This is the famous episode in which, because he wants to look cool, Bart wants to look cool for like the cool kids, I guess. It's also their first appearance. Jimbo, Dolph, and Kearney.
Dolph, yes, Dolph. Because it's like Dolph. Were they making a reference to Dolph Lundgren, or were they making a reference to Dolph Sweet?
Well, that's interesting. I mean,
they weren't making any of those references. I just really wanted to be able to say Dolph Sweet's name on a podcast.
But the thing about it is, like, Dolph is an interesting name to think of for a kid. It's not a very common name. Do you even know, have you ever in your life, besides the people you've just mentioned, have you ever actually known anyone named Dolph?
No, not at all.
Jimbo, that's like a nickname. Kearney's a weird name. In any case, they wanted to give these kids interesting names, and it's to look cool for them. He decides to chop off the head of the statue of Jebediah Springfield, who was the founder of Springfield, and that's essentially the plot of the episode. It begins in media res, and I believe this was a post-production decision. It was not something. The episode was not written that way. Post-production is a weird thing to say when talking about a cartoon. During the editing, because it wasn't like this was shot, so there's no like post-production. It says this is animated. So during the editing of the episode is when they decided that they would restructure and have it be in media res. Did you know anything about that?
I did not. I did know, obviously it starts in the middle of the action near the end, so obviously it's in media res. But I don't know how intentional it is, because the performances aren't quite where they eventually wind up. So Dan Castellaneta's delivery is sort of dry, but he makes, like, right off the bat, a really, really off-color joke for The Simpsons.
Bart, when I was your age, I pulled a few boners.
Like, every kid finds out that in, like, the 50s and 60s, making a mistake or, a blooper is a boner. That's one of those things where maybe, just maybe, the show had a mandate from Fox that it kind of swim in Married with Children's wake. Because it is, about a family that doesn't necessarily get along in traditional ways. They're a bit dysfunctional. The matriarch of the family differs because Peg Bundy was awful. I mean, both fathers are complete idiots, and they're almost irredeemable. I think, obviously the writers of The Simpsons do a lot to make Homer sympathetic over time, and he becomes this beloved character, so you kind of forgive his trespasses even in later seasons. You kind of go, oh, that's just Homer. Whereas, are you ever supposed to side with an Al Bundy? Are you ever supposed to side with an Archie Bunker? That's not reality. At least it's not mine, though. I guess I knew a lot of kids when we were all like, all our dads thought that Al Bundy was the best, and it's just like, he's a piece of shit. Why do you think he's a hero? Because he dumps on his wife? Like, wow, you guys stunningly suck. But I knew a lot of blue collar guys growing up who, they were all these like, steel workers and iron workers. They're union guys, but they voted for Reagan, so they're not the sharpest tools in the shed. So I guess when they saw a guy on TV who came home from his miserable job every day and stuck his hands down the front of his pants, they were like, I feel represented now. Shitty white dude on television. There's a me now.
Well, those are people who basically looked at Archie Bunker. You were talking about Archie Bunker in the Mad Magazine parody of All in the Family. At one point, Archie Bunker has like a line to the extent of, "Oh, come on, I do represent the common American. They're not laughing at me, they're laughing with me." And you go like, there's truth to that, of course. That's what they were accentuating there. I don't have quite the same experience. My dad is meathead. My dad's a hippie, so
Right.
Yeah, he did not identify with Archie Bunker, and he never really watched Married with Children. In fact, the few times that a few clips of it or whatever would go on, like he just found that grotesque. He didn't want to watch that show. He didn't think it was funny. He just found it stupid. My father, a Latin American hippie, basically found the stereotypical blue collar American to be a douchebag. So it wouldn't he wouldn't find it funny. He did like All in the Family, but All in the Family does have the meathead character and Gloria and everything else to sort of balance it out. And he did like The Simpsons, because again, the sensibilities of that show would not sympathize. So yeah, going back to it's true that there was a kind of, this can be edgy like Married with Children, but let's make the Al Bundy stand-in. Let's make our blue-collar dad a sympathetic character ultimately, not just like he's kind of an ass, but he's not a bad guy. Like, he never does things maliciously.
Yeah, he's clueless, whereas Al Bundy's just kind of an unrepentant piece of shit.
He's just an asshole. Like, Al Bundy's just an asshole, whereas Homer is just a moron who much of the time actually has good intentions.
Yeah.
He's somewhat selfish, perhaps, but he's ultimately a well-meaning person who does care about his family to some degree.
His inspiring advice in this episode comes from the decent place of, oh, I want my son to be happy and popular. His stupidity is the inciting stupidity for the entire episode.
I was wondering, how important is it to be popular?
I'm glad you asked, son. Being popular is the most important thing in the world.
The other thing that is seen here for the first time, I think this is the first time that Reverend Lovejoy appears as well.
That could be true, yeah.
So this is like the first time that you really see a lot of that. I mean, they go to Mass, and then the kids are in Sunday school, and there's that whole thing that they introduce. And, I mean, they do parody it in some way, I suppose, but the story has a moral center, I guess. They show the church, they show Sunday school and all of that stuff, but they don't, considering that this show was tagged as being really edgy and anti-establishment and all of this stuff back when it first came out, their treatment of church, at least here, they at the end you have the whole town with like torches and pitchforks, but you don't really have, they don't paint the church in any kind of negative light, is what I'm saying.
No, not really. And I think that the Simpsons don't live on the coast, so there was no need to be sort of like, we're too cool for this. Like, it's a Midwestern family, and religion's part of the fabric of the community, and so rather than really passing judgment on it, it's kind of depicted pretty accurately. Because, man, kids screwed off in church all the time. Like, you didn't want to listen to it, and it was usually playing over your head anyway. Yeah, it just gets treated in a very matter-of-fact way, and in a way that also makes it seem like the act itself of going to church and the sort of like, okay, we've got to get ready for this, quit fooling around, okay, quit fiddling, the drive to church, Sunday school, like it all feels very universal. For me, Sunday school and church were separate. Like, you went to church, then you went to Sunday school, so you had a double serving. You had 2 scoops of the Lord that day. Man, oh man, Shevitz.
That was my next question. I mean, because you're from the Midwest.
Indeed.
Right? So in essence, I mean, what is portrayed here? And when this aired in 1990, so you were already a teenager at that point. But was your upbringing anything remotely like this? Did you go to church? Did you come from a religious family?
I was a Catholic school kid until the 5th grade. I was a child of divorce, so I didn't have well, my mom was definitely not Marge. My mom was kind of Peg Bundy, with a violent streak, I guess. And Dad was operating from the Homer Simpson playbook. A good guy, a sweet guy in a lot of ways. busted ass at work, trying to raise two unruly little assholes. There was definitely some Bart in my existence. I was a smart ass who definitely did not want to sit still in church or school or anywhere. If there was a chance that I was going to get attention by breaking the room in the middle of a teacher's lecture, I was going to do that. I mean, it's not like, it's weird. It's not like I didn't think The Simpsons was a particularly edgy show, but at the same time, Bart appeals to an age that was maybe a little younger than I was at the time. But watching him, I was like, oh yeah, I remember getting into shit like that when I was a kid. So, spiritually, there's some truth to what that looks and feels like in the Midwest. And I think I'm probably, I hope I'm not the first person to say that. It's actually not, everything's ridiculously heightened in The Simpsons. And I think that's why The Simpsons endures and sort of the early episodes hold up from a storytelling standpoint, even though maybe the animation isn't quite there and the performances aren't quite there yet. To me, watching Married with Children now is tedious. It doesn't hold up at all, and it's just really rotten and mean-spirited. Whereas The Simpsons holds up because for all of the absurdity of Homer, just the opening credits, Homer's, fiddling with nuclear waste. It's weird. It's a strange show, but it's rooted in sort of an emotional and experiential reality of sort of small town life. The way families function and the way faith function in families' lives, that stuff's valid.
I agree, and it's very grounded, and like you said, it accounts for its universal appeal. I think one of the reasons it was able to achieve global success was because it was able to tap into that. Although for some people, like in Latin America or whatever, it's more like a window into American culture, there are still enough going on there that they can relate to, because I'm Hispanic, but I didn't really, my dad is not religious, so I didn't go to church while I was in the US. The only time that I had any experience that's even remotely like this was whenever I would come visit family here in Bolivia. It's Sunday Mass, so we would all go to Sunday Mass or whatever it was while I was a kid. That was when I had that. I had my first communion at the behest of my aunts. I had that here. I had that done here. So, that whole thing where, although I don't practice it and I don't, I have nothing to do with it, I'm familiar with it. And so
right
here, it's very Catholic, highly Catholic country. And so, of course, they can relate to that. In the case, The Simpsons, though, are not Catholic. What is portrayed there is not a Catholic church at all. It is it's evangelical Christian. Reverend Lovejoy is married. Right?
Yeah.
He's not a Catholic priest. The whole concept of Sunday school also, I guess there's two different kinds. But yeah, I didn't actually go to Sunday school. That I never did. But yeah, it's pretty accurate.
The ventriloquist goes to heaven, but the dummy doesn't.
What about a robot with a human brain?
I don't know. All these questions. Is a little blind faith too much to ask?
There are a lot of firsts in this episode, apart from the church, apart from Apu. Krusty and Sideshow Bob appear here.
Yeah, for 0.2 seconds out of nowhere in the mob scene. You don't even know why.
No, but during the actual episode, there's that...
There's someone out there in Krusty Land who has committed an atrocity. If you know who cut off Jebediah's head, turn him in. And Krusty will send you a free slide whistle, just like Sideshow Bob.
There was nothing, at the time that this was airing, there was nothing like this on TV. I can't think of anything, even for kids, I can't think of any show like this, where you have a host who does skits and shows cartoon shorts. And was there anything like that? Did anything like Krusty exist even in 1990?
There's part of me, and I can't speak to it with 100% certainty, but I'm almost positive that the Bozo Show was that exactly what you're describing, and exactly kind of, I don't know why, is it dawning on me now? Am I just coming to this where it's Krusty is basically the fucking Bozo Show out of Chicago. We're supposed to be in the Midwest. I want to say that guy, the guy who played Bozo, played him just forever. Like, it was one of those things where in kindergarten I saw the Bozo Show on TV, and I was flipping through the channels at like 17, and holy shit, there's that old guy doing Bozo the Clown right now. It's like, it was just endless. I think that show that show was running for a really long time. And yeah, it's a show about a pseudo sketch comedy show / variety show about starring a clown. So yeah, that did exist. They are sort of riffing on something real. It's even more obscure than like every region having its own horror host, whether it's like Elvira or Svengoolie or Zachary or
Ghoulardi.
Yes, exactly.
Ernie Anderson.
Saturday's a special night on the Love Boat when the captain's past catches up with him.
Are you going to tell me about sex?
And she wants her daddy.
Here's the thing. See, of course I knew about Elvira. She even had a movie. But those regional ones, like I never saw Ghoulardi. I never saw that stuff. I knew about Elvira because she had a movie in the 80s. And then they never, that I can remember, they didn't show the Elvira, like, movie show in New York. That's the thing, too. Like, these things, like that thing you're talking about, the Bozo Show, which is out of Chicago, is very much a regional thing. Maybe they used to show that on, like, in the mornings, but I was not familiar with it. Not in New York, at least. It might have been on some channel, but somebody would have to tell me, no, Eric, you're wrong. In New York, on one of those syndicated things like Channel 9 or whatever, or Channel 5, at 6:30 in the morning, that may be true.
Bonkers for Bozo.
I'm crazy about that clown.
I'm bonkers for Bozo.
7 o'clock weekday mornings on Channel 9.
Like there was some stuff that only played in some markets. So it wasn't until you get basic cable, and then you have like, I don't know if it's TBS or whatever, they used to show The Littlest Hobo, which is a Canadian show about a dog.
Maybe tomorrow I'll want to settle down. Until tomorrow I'll just keep moving on.
Okay, so like the concept of like a variety show for children, for example, is something that I was somewhat familiar with or became familiar with in the Latin American context, because over here, even in the 90s, it was really popular. You had shows, it wasn't a clown, but it was like Xuxa, a Brazilian superstar, who I believe they tried to make something out of in the States sometime in the 90s.
I was just going to say, yeah, they did.
They tried. It didn't work.
Yes.
But like, Matt Groening is from Portland, Oregon. I'm going to assume that when he was growing up, there was something like this. There must have been. When he and the writers of The Simpsons were growing up, they must have had some regional thing like Bozo. Because even Garfield, created by Jim Davis, who is also from the Midwest, I believe he's from Indiana.
Yeah.
He's got Binky or Blinky the Clown or whatever it is. So the whole thing about a clown having like a variety show on TV seems to be a very Midwest thing, but it wasn't something that I was familiar with. And then the whole concept of a variety show for kids, again, in Latin America, yeah, that's what Xuxa would do. Xuxa was the Brazilian one, but she also had, out of Argentina, she shot a version in Spanish, and she was very popular for many reasons. And even as a teenager, I would watch the Xuxa show for reasons that had nothing to do with the... So in any case, yeah, there was that. But again, in the States, I never really had any kind of experience that remotely where there was like a kids show that was anything like that. It just shows that this show has very, very much Midwestern American roots. So
Indeed.
all of its references in that sense are still centered around there, even though eventually it gets so that Krusty is like this huge star who, eventually when they like balloon it, he used to have a talk show, like Johnny.
I do wonder that, in that he has like a Jack Parr, sort of Jack Benny, sort of Tonight Show kind of thing back in the day. This does make me wonder, like, do they have, when you talk about these regional hosts for these kid shows and things, they all kind of come from somewhere. They all have this sort of, the guy was a newsman or the sports guy, but then they put him in a goofy wig and a giant like flower on his lapel, and now he's the kid show host because he needed to be. Like, they had to fill that programming somehow. So the news guy takes one for the team, and now he's in grease paint, and it becomes a thing, and it's like, holy shit. I know that people who worked on the Bozo show were people who had like other gigs.
But hang on, wasn't Letterman? I mean, Letterman, again, a Midwestern native.
Yeah.
Wasn't Letterman like a weatherman?
And there was a version of his show that was a morning show.
And that started locally, right, in Indiana,
right.
or where, and then it just eventually, obviously, he became huge and moved into the big leagues. But yeah, that is interesting, that experience of like the guy that starts out as a weatherman, and then like he has a variety show, and then eventually, the fates conspire to. Well, I mean, you have to be somewhat talented, I suppose. I mean,
I don't know. To be a clown, I don't know.
Well, to be a cheesy clown for a variety show for kids, maybe you don't need tons of talent. You just need the capacity to be willing to embarrass yourself.
Yeah. I've never liked clowns. I've never seen the appeal. I'm not scared of them. I just worry about them. I worry about them, like, as people. Like, are you sure, dude? That's the path you're on. That was your choice?
Yeah, I don't like clowns either. They used to frighten me when I was a kid. Obviously, I'm an adult now, so they don't frighten me. But they used to frighten me when I was a kid. I just, they're creepy. They're fucking creepy. The concept is just weird. All right, well, one last thing that I would like to talk about here, which I think is relevant to the episode. So ultimately, the plot is about Bart chops off the head of this revered figure, right, in Springfield history. And then, obviously the lesson of the episode is, don't do these things. Don't let peer pressure steer you down a bad path or whatever. That's the moral they go with, and that's the context of the episode. And part of that is because I'm pretty sure that had this story been done later in the show's run, like a couple of seasons in, if they had chosen to go with a similar storyline, they probably would have explored the context of the mythologizing of historical figures, which I think I think a later episode probably would have explored that, because what they chose to do here with the concept is pretty simplistic, and it's ultimately just the story of, Bart shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have defaced this monument because, it's not cool to do that.
It is a kind of a simplistic moral, and I think a later episode, once they sort of found their footing and had a sense of what they wanted to do with the show, they might have gone that route. They might have played around with like, yeah, but who is Jebediah Springfield? And then you'd find out that he was, likely a slave owner.
Yeah, right. This terrible, horrible human being. Because the only nod towards that they do at all in the episode is when they're showing like this recreation of whatever, saying that he's legendary.
Jebediah Obadiah Zachariah Jedediah Springfield came west in 1838. Along the way, he met a ferocious bear and killed him with his bare hands. Although modern historians recently uncovered evidence that the bear, in fact, probably killed him.
You go like, well, if that were true, I mean, I think you would know how a historical figure died if he had been mauled by a bear. But it does show how the myth is that he wrestled the bear with his bare hands, but that's probably not actually true. Okay, but extrapolate that. Let's get deeper about it. Like, a lot of figures, cultural figures in U.S. history, like Davy Crockett or whatever, have a certain myth about them. But if we were to actually go into the reality of who these people were, these might not be such heroic people. Certainly, I mean, at best, they have feet of clay, at best. But I think that it's probably much worse than that in most cases.
You mentioned at the top sort of what's happening in March of 2020, sort of geopolitically. And I feel like anytime somebody asks, like, well, what would the founding fathers have thought about this? You sort of have to say, okay, well, but do you really want to know what the syphilitic, slave-owning, dumb as shit, wealthy guys who kind of fucking lucked into it, like, do we really want to know what they thought about it? Do we really want to know what they thought about anything? These guys were assholes. So yeah, like anybody you're building a statue to, at this point, you've got to wonder, when was the statue made? Who decided to make it? And why the fuck is it that guy? Like, and you're gonna dig enough and go, and probably not even very deep, and go, oh yeah, we don't need to mythologize this guy. This is ridiculous. This is a mistake. Let's just go ahead and take that down.
Right. I mean, there's a statue of Christopher Columbus in New York, Columbus Circle, and
right.
I mean, the whole myth about Christopher Columbus, that's exactly what you say. I mean, we have people who are like, let's do away with Columbus Day. It's ridiculous. Why are we honoring him as a hero when what did he really do? The European heroes who brought disease to the new continent and destruction, and let's put statues of them. So I do think that they do drop the ball. They in the sense that this could have been more interesting if they'd explored that more, but that's not what they were interested in doing with that episode anyway.
But again, I don't know that it's a dropped ball, because I think that the show, you greenlight a show like that, and the show kind of does what it does because Fox at the time was trying to fit a very specific niche. Once it becomes this runaway hit, once the writers and the performers get their sea legs under them, they're ready to try stuff like that. And it goes in that. The Simpsons frequently does go in that direction. That's another reason why it endures. It remains topical. It tries to poke holes in things that are real, but it didn't start out that way. And so, I can hardly fault, I can't even fault the writers and the performers for taking the time to get there, considering that Fox at the time was a fledgling network that, was trying to find an identity. And so the identity they staked out early was in sort of subversive raunch. I mean, that network could have built its entire identity around Christina Applegate and a halter top.
You know what he calls me? His little squeeze toy.
Gee, I'd love to meet him.
You'll be nice to him, won't you, Daddy?
Don't worry, Pumpkin. I'll show him the same kind of respect that any father would show a 41-year-old man who dates his teenage daughter.
So what do we think of this episode? Does it hold up? Is it all right? What do we think of it as a piece of comedy? What do we think of it in the context of The Simpsons?
I think it's slight. I think it's sweet, maybe a little bit. Like I said, I sort of like the more subversive, like Bart arguing that he's really brought the town together, because even if they're unified in wanting to destroy him, they're unified. It isn't that special. But I think the more overwhelming sort of message is, sort of learning that, he and Homer both kind of learning that, popularity probably isn't everything. And we know that even in our culture, like, 320 years on from that particular episode of The Simpsons, we know that's not true. Popularity is still everything, because now you can actually monetize that popularity on YouTube, and get some amazingly successful no talent pieces of shit.
Hint, hint. I hope people give us a lot of likes.
Yes. Hey, like me, I'm an obnoxious no talent piece of shit. Do you need me to shoot a can of energy drink? It's like everybody's so gross, and it's all surface and shallow, and to me that's just America. That's where we are. That's who we are. And so it's a slight episode. And I think, like you said, future episodes might have gone into would have been an exploration of how shallow it is for the entire town to rise up and want to kill a kid because he defaced a statue, because the guy who has the statue is probably pretty undeserving. So yeah, I mean, but this is episode 8, right? 8?
Oh yeah, that was one thing. It has an on-screen title. That's rare. It's not something that they do on The Simpsons very often. It's the first time it happens in this series. I think they do it again a couple of times where you have like an on-screen title card for the episode. A lot of these episodes tend to have sort of fun titles. And so it is interesting that they don't, although they have those titles in production, you don't see those titles on screen. So this is a question that's not related to The Simpsons. Do you like episode titles? Like, and do you, what's your feeling on them? Do you prefer the show to actually have the title on screen?
I don't know. Kind of depends. It depends on the show. It depends on the sensibility of the show. Sometimes it just really doesn't matter. Sometimes it's completely irrelevant, and then sometimes it sets up a tone. Like for example, a show I watch a lot, Supernatural, has episode titles that are completely irrelevant. They don't matter.
So Supernatural, which I've never seen, by the way, and I will eventually get around to it. I understand it has something like 27 seasons or something like that. I don't.
It just beat MASH for the longest running hour long. Like, no, they're closing it out. It's 15.
Okay, well that's, I mean, for considering what it is, because it's an hour long drama. It's not like a sitcom or whatever it is. That's a long run.
Yeah, it's a super long run.
Carry on my wayward son. There'll be peace when you are.
I think for a serialized show, since you're kind of telling long stories over a whole season, maybe episode titles are a little bit kind of like irrelevant. Whereas something like Star Trek, you know, when it was episodic television in the 60s and in the 80s with Next Generation or Miami Vice, an episodic show where you have self-contained stories, having an episode title has its value, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I do like episodic shows to have episode titles, and my favorite episode titles will always be for Star Trek shows because they always had the most pretentious titles.
Yeah.
You know, my favorite episode title of all time, it's from this third season of Star Trek. It's "For the world is hollow and I have touched the sky."
You are forbidden to gaze at the book.
We mean no desecration. We must consult the book to help you.
It is blasphemy. The punishment is death.
So great, man. It's been great having you. Thank you once again for this. It's been a great chat. You're always here to bring the strong opinions and
about things I don't give a shit about. That's
exactly. Yes. No, but you're always here for the for the serious talks, and it's cool. And I'm definitely going to bring you back for the second season, where the episodes get even better. Like they do start to grow and they become richer. And I think we're going to have a lot more stuff to talk about.
You'll have things you want to talk about. I will too.
So that's it for this week's installment of the Simpsons Countdown. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this, please give us a like. If you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe. Feel free to leave a comment or two expressing your appreciation. And if it isn't too much trouble, please do share this with all of your friends, both virtual and actual, on your social media platform of choice. Keep in mind also that everyone is entitled to their point of view, and it's perfectly okay to disagree with anything expressed by myself or my guest. But remember to please keep it civil. I'm Erix Antoine, and next time I'll be joined by a terrific person from Sacramento. We will discuss Life on the Fast Lane, in which Marge almost has a torrid affair with a French bowling instructor. It's a fun episode, and I'm sure the discussion will be a lot of fun too. So I hope you'll join us. And in the meantime, stay safe, stay at home, and take care of yourselves.